And thanks to everyone for joining us. The topic of the presentation, Isaiah's Lion and Lamb, Animal Inspiration for Justice and Hope. I've already been introduced. What I'll be talking about will be appearing soon in the last chapter of a book I've just finished writing called Mouth of the Donkey, Reimagining Biblical Animals. But I'll also do a little plug for my book before that. If you're interested in Jewish spirituality or spirituality in general, and you like this presentation, you might want to explore the book, The Infinity Inside. Now, back to the presentation. We will return to this image of The Peaceable Kingdom by Edward Hicks in just a little while. This will be the outline of the session. I'll say just a little bit about why perhaps animal friendship videos and stories and photos are so moving to us. Then I'll introduce the fabulous Ancient Animal Oracle by the prophet Isaiah. I'll tell you a little bit about the prophet and the historical context. We'll read the oracle together. It's very short. All the text you need will be right on the screen. And then we'll look at it from three perspectives as promised in the description. Who do the animals represent? Work of classical commentators. How do we live into the story? That is, what are the instructions coded in there, general as they are, for how to create this peaceful society of coexistence? And finally, answer the question, is it possible for such a society to exist? Obviously, I will argue that it is. And then we'll have discussion according to the format I outlined, and if there's time, we'll sing. As you can see, the picture on the right is not actually a wolf and a lamb, but it is a dog that is close kin to a wolf cuddling with a lamb. And apparently Nanook the Husky has a backstory, and he has been rehabilitated and retrained from being a barnyard killer to a barnyard protector. Some really famous animal friendship stories that you might know if you live in North America, and in fact, if you live in Europe and maybe other places, because these are stories that have been translated and shared around the world. Charlotte's Web, in which a spider and a rat and a few of their helpers team up to save a pig from being slaughtered and eaten. They don't challenge the farm system or the eating of pigs, but they save their precious friend Wilbur. Or the Brementown Musicians, where 4 farm animals, past the age where they're useful, all have come to understand that their owners wish to get rid of them. So they team up together and decide they're going to become musicians and sing for their supper. Well, when the 4 of them sing together, their voice is so terrifying that people flee and they inherit a place to live with great abundance. Both of these stories are adorable in themselves for the animal cooperation, but they are also each very obvious allegories for human beings. Charlotte's Web, if only we could band together to protect our friends, save each and every one from the clutches of danger. The Brementown Musicians, if only the workers who are cast aside could team up, not to overthrow, but to just get what they need to live. Wouldn't that be incredible? So one theory of why animal friendship stories are so moving is because they're really about us, and they give us humans a glimpse of what could be possible in our lives and our communities. Isaiah chapter 11, 6 through 9 is really an ancient animal friendship story in this mode about the animals and about us as well. This is just one of many artistic representations of it. Bit of historical context. Who is the prophet Isaiah? Scholars think that the book of Isaiah contains the prophecies of at least 2 prophets. Chapter 11 is part of the work of the prophet that we call First Isaiah. He is the one who is named in the superscript at the beginning of the book, the date and time stamp. His name is Yeshaya ben Amos. He is a court prophet. He works directly with kings. He's not a marginalized guy on the street corner. He's famous and in a good position. And he worked for the Judean kings Uzziah, Yotam, Achaz, and Chizkiyahu, mid to late 8th century BCE. That was a time where there were all different kinds of political unrest, internal as well as external. But the most terrifying one is in the year 701, as Syria lays siege to Jerusalem, but does not conquer it. Assyria is repelled. But people have their eyes open and they know that this will not be the last assault from the Assyrian Empire intent on taking the Judean territory. I should add that the actual composition of prophetic books is mysterious to all scholars. We do not know if the prophets spoke their amazing highbrow poetry extemporaneously. We don't know if they wrote it down and then read it. We don't know if they talked about it and their students wrote it down and then edited it. We have no idea. But what we do have a clear idea of are the main ideas of prophetic teaching. And while every prophet is a little bit different, they all agree that there is a God who is a God of the entire world. This God oversees all of the nations. This God judges, punishes, and restores. And that the emotion that this God expresses through the restoration is compassion and love. And that's a bit of what Abraham Joshua Heschel was getting at in his very famous study of the prophets called The Prophets, where he talks about the prophets having the experience of sort of feeling the emotional beating heart of God and trying to express in love, in words, God's disappointment and God's compassion and love for all of us. And you will see that in the oracle we're about to study. Just to give you a slightly larger context of this particular oracle, it's actually a 2-part oracle by Isaiah. We're looking at part 2. And I like to put this in because if you think that part 2, the vision of the animals living in unity, is unlikely, check out part 1 that comes before it. Isaiah says, first, we're going to have a non-corrupt politician who operates only with the principles of equity and justice and spirit. And after that, the animal species, or whatever they represent, will come into unity. And here is the oracle. This is my translation. It is not the most poetic of all translations, but it does render the words in ways that are faithful to the Hebrew and also fit with the way I like to speak about it. A wolf shall visit with a lamb, a leopard lie down with a kid, a calf, a young lion, and the fatling together, and a little child shall guide them. A cow and a bear shall graze. Their young lie down together, and a lion like an ox shall eat straw. A baby shall play over a viper's hole, and over an adder's fang, a toddler shall extend his hand. No one will do evil or destroy anything on my holy mountain, for the land shall be filled with knowledge of Hashem as water covers the sea. Just a couple of definitions. If you're not familiar with the names of snakes, an adder is just a synonym for a viper, a species of snake that hunts by, or many species of snakes, a broad category of snakes who hunt by injecting their prey with venom. And a fatling is apparently, I'm not an expert on this one, but apparently any animal that has been fed very rich food in preparation for being eaten. What do the animals represent? Here are the views of several classical commentators. The Radak and Abarbanel say that the animals simply represent themselves on one level. And they say that actually they're living, remember, in a Torah-based universe. And they say that, well, I don't know if they really live in a Torah-based universe, but when they write their commentaries, they draw on a Torah-based universe. And they say, if you think about it, there obviously was a time in the history of the world when no animals ate each other. Because if you think logically about the Garden of Eden, where there was just the parent pair of each species, if the wolf ate the lamb, if the wolf ate the sheep in the Garden of Eden, then all the sheep would have been gone and there would be no future generations of sheep. Not only that, after 2 meals, the wolves would have starved to death and there'd be no wolves either. And similarly, on Noah's Ark, the animals had to live together in peace. And so they say it is possible, and the prophet Isaiah is teaching us that there was a primordial time, it's the original state of the world, and it is possible we can go back there. The Radak also adds that the animals don't just represent themselves, but this is a teaching for our time, because he says every society is fractured. And outside of utopian time, there has always been a predatory wealthy class and poor people who suffer from this exploitation. But he says, Isaiah is telling us that we humans can copy the animals in the Garden of Eden and eventually find a way to live together. So you see already, these commentators are not drawing their commentaries out of thin air. They're really studying the Torah intensely, cross-referencing things, and adding their own beliefs and hopes and aspirations. The Malbim says that the animals clearly represent nations. And for example, he says the lion clearly represents Assyria, because we know that Assyrian kings used the lion as one of their royal insignias and symbols. And so he says what Isaiah is telling us is that the balance of power between the predatory empires and the small self-governing nations, this balance of power will come to a peaceful equilibrium in the region. The empires will realize that it is not really in their interest to constantly be at war raiding the smaller countries. And then the smaller countries will be free to put their attention toward creating the just and equitable local societies that they yearn for. It's a vision of politics, says the Malbi. On a more personal level, Reb Nachman and the Rambam say that this oracle is also about an interchange that is going to happen to human beings, because without this inner change, none of the big social change will be possible. People are going to, in the words of Reb Nachman, people are going to reach toward God, experience God's compassion, and that is going to teach them bit by bit to be compassionate to others. The Rambam, philosopher, puts it a little bit more intellectually, saying people are going to come to understand what wisdom means. And that wisdom means something like what Musar teaches, that we will get our inner qualities in order and in right relationship with one another, and then we will be ready to live together with others, whatever level of the social ladder we are living on. This is one way of looking at the oracle in general, just wondering what it's about and what lesson we're supposed to take from it. The second level, looking a little bit at the animal metaphors, specifically in the poetry. And I put this little slide here just to give us a moment to remember that there are some parts of the Tanakh that are written in very simple Hebrew, and I will tell you that the prophets are not one of them. The prophets are difficult to understand, often highbrow poetry filled with metaphor. No sooner have they introduced a metaphor in one verse and you think you got it, then suddenly there's a whole new metaphorical universe in the next verse. And if you're trying to hang on to the first metaphor, that's not the way they want you to think. They're just piling the stuff on. They are also, believe it or not, speaking not just to the kings and not just to the people, but they're also speaking to the other poet prophets in their circle. And so everything they say is also filled with association to the work of other poet prophets. And those are a few of the things that you'll see in just these three animals I want to mention. A wolf shall visit with a lamb. We're going to focus just on the wolf and the lamb for a moment. I love this picture, by the way. What is going on? What does Isaiah mean when Isaiah talks about the wolf and the lamb? The wolf, commentators think, is a reference to Jacob's prophecy about his son Benjamin. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. He consumes the foe, divides the spoil. Actually, the original Benjamin never does this, but in a story in Judges, the tribe of Benjamin does this. They kidnap women, they go to war against the rest of Israel, they murder tens of thousands. So a wolf, commentators say, is the out of control violent person. Lamb in biblical Hebrew is keves, which is a cognate of a word that when applied to human beings means a conquered person. So we've got the invading, violent, local militia warlord gang, and we've got those who are conquered by them. But in Isaiah's oracle, the wolf shall visit with the lamb. The Hebrew for visit here, it's so often translated as dwell, but it is not dwelling. It is gar, temporarily residing. The wolf will be the guest in the territory of the lamb, the conquered one. There will be in this time a reversal of power where the mild-mannered lambs are governing and they are welcoming their guests, the wolves, without a policy of revenge. A leopard will lie down with a kid. You might think in the manner of biblical poetry that this is just a synonym. The wolf shall visit with the lamb, the leopard lie down with the kid. But Isaiah is adding something with the metaphor of the leopard. Isaiah is speaking to the community of prophets, where a prophetic motif that we see supposedly later in Jeremiah comes forward. Jeremiah actually asks, can a leopard change its spots? And Jeremiah says, no, it cannot. And Jeremiah means a person who is evil cannot become good. I mean, a person who is very habituated to doing evil. But Isaiah disagrees. Isaiah absolutely thinks that a leopard, human or animal, supposedly, can change its spots. One more. This is my favorite one. A cow and a bear shall graze, their young lie down together. The cow and the bear. The cow in the Hebrew is para. It is a feminine noun. We are talking here about the mother cow. And if you know even the simplest things about agriculture, you know that the cow is very often a bereaved mother, with her calf being sold or slaughtered. The bear in prophetic literature, not 100%, but about 90% of the time, the bear is a bereaved mother. She is a bear who is angry and violent because someone harmed her cubs and she's looking for them. In Isaiah's oracle, these grieving mothers bond. They raise their children side by side. They teach them a new kind of friendship. Finally, the lion, like the ox, will eat straw. Let's just be clear. The ox is not in biblical literature the calm prey animal. Biblical ox are fearsome. I put this picture just in case you're very urban and not familiar with oxen, so you see how gigantic they are next to a person. In the Torah, the ox is dangerous. If you don't restrain it and train it, it kills. And you and the ox are responsible for what it does. Yet in the stories in the Tanakh, lions are mostly fearsome, but there are more than one story where the lion is an agent of God and stands next to either humans or prey animals without harming them when they are following divine instructions. This part of the oracle is saying, even the most fierce can change. What Isaiah is talking about is not just that the weak are going to pray for peace and change. Everyone will. Can it really happen? Reality or dream? The American painter Edward Hicks thinks that it can really happen. Hicks was a Quaker minister in Pennsylvania. He was a youth, he grew up shortly after the Revolutionary War. He lived in a time of social unrest, unrest in his church, conflict within his family, and to work out his personal conflicts and to comment on current events, he painted more than 60 versions of Isaiah's oracle, putting it in different settings. The most famous version he painted depicts the Shakamaxon Treaty of 1683. This is the picture. On the hill, my holy mountain, you see the animals of the peaceable kingdom relaxing rather peaceably, although the fiercest among them, the leopard and the lion, are looking at us with challenging faces. Down in the valley is a depiction of the meeting between colonial Quaker leader William Penn and Chief Tamanend of the Lenape, each with their small group of associates. They are meeting and they are discussing a peace and friendship treaty in their region. The only document we have from that treaty is this one wampum belt presented by a Lenape artist to Penn and his people. It shows a rather stout settler in a funny hat holding hands with a rather lean member of the Lenape. I don't know if they're making any value judgments here, or they just thought that the settlers wore so many clothes, everybody looked gigantic. This is the gift. As I said, there is no written record of the treaty provisions. There are several theories about that, but the most likely is that they simply made a general agreement to live in a harmonious way on the land together. And while there were several skirmishes, this agreement kept the peace in the region for the better part of 70 years. Disturbing the peace is laid at the feet of two of William Penn's sons, but that's a separate story for another day. The peace and friendship treaties existed in real life. It is a particular type of treaty. They existed in Nova Scotia, the province of Nova Scotia, in Eastern Canada. The first treaty was affirmed in 1726 by the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy First Nations and representatives of Great Britain. The terms of the treaty were very simple. The First Nations agreed not to assault the British in their settlements, and the British agreed not to assault members of local communities as they fished, hunted, and planted. And should individuals in some kind of rage or anxiety break the treaty, both groups agreed not to settle disputes by taking revenge. Eventually, as their relationships grew, they added specific economic agreements, but they retained the language of the original peace and friendship treaties. Just a statement from Mi'kmaq scholar Marie Batiste about what the treaties were about. She says, they're about sharing what the Mi'kmaq had in abundance, and they're about the ideal of equal opportunity to share in the abundance of the land through equality and respecting human rights. They are not about conquest, might makes right, or other theories leading to injustice. These are not treaties about who rules, who wins. They are about how to live together. And they express these very principles that Isaiah talks about in his oracle. The predator-prey relationships are suspended. Even the fiercest animals, the local warriors and the aggressive settlers, they share their resources together, and the mothers raise their children to simply assume the terms of the peace and friendship treaty and to live together. Ki mal'a ha'aretz de'a et Adonai. For the land will be filled with intimate knowledge of the ineffable one. And if you feel that outside of synagogue prayer, you need to sing Ad Hashem, sing whatever you sing. Ki mal'a ha'aretz de'a, ki mal'a ha'aretz de'a, ki mal'a ha'aretz de'a, de'a et Adonai. Ki mal'a ha'aretz de'a, ki mal'a ha'aretz de'a, ki mal'a ha'aretz de'a, Dea et Adonai, Dea, Dea, Dea et Adonai, Dea, Dea, Dea et Adonai. May it be so.